Chapter 14 of The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits by William Hazlitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 14, Mr. Brougham and Sir Francis Burdett. There is a class of eloquence which has been described and particularly insisted on under the style and title of Irish eloquence. There is another class which it is not absolutely unfair to oppose to this, and that is the Scotch. The first of these is entirely the offspring of impulse, the last of mechanism. The one is as full of fancy as it is bare of facts. The other excludes all fancy and is weighed down with facts. The one is all fire, the other all ice. The one nothing but enthusiasm, extravagance, eccentricity, the other nothing but logical deductions and the most approved postulates. The one, without scruple, may, with reckless zeal, throws the reins loose on the neck of the imagination. The other pulls up with a curb bridle and starts at every casual object it meets in the way as a bugbear. The genius of Irish oratory stands forth in the naked majesty of untutored nature, its eyes glancing wildly around on all subjects, its tongue darting forked fire. The genius of Scottish eloquence is armed in all the panoply of the schools. Its drawling, ambiguous dialect seconds its circumspect dialects. From behind the visor that guards its mouth and shadows its pent-up brows, it sees no visions but its own set purpose, its own data, and its own dogmas. It has no figures nor no fantasies, but those which busy care draws in the brains of men, or which set off its own superior acquirements and of wisdom. It scorns to tread the primrose path of dalliance. It shrinks back from it as from a precipice, and keeps in the iron railway of the understanding. Irish oratory, on the contrary, is a sort of aeronaut. It is always going up in a balloon and breaking its neck or coming down in the parachute. It is filled full with gaseous matter, with whim and fancy, with alliteration and antithesis, with heated passion and bloated metaphors that burst the slender silken covering of sense, and the airy pageant that glittered in empty space and rose in all the bliss of ignorance flutters and sinks down to its native bogs. If the Irish orator riots in a studied neglect of his subject and a natural confusion of ideas, playing with words, ranging them into all sorts of fantastic combinations, because in the unlettered void or chaos of his mind there is no obstacle to their coalescing in any shapes they please, it must be confessed that the eloquence of the Scotch is encumbered with an excess of knowledge, that it cannot get on for a crowd of difficulties, that it staggers under a load of topics, that it is so environed in the forms of logic and rhetoric as to be equally precluded from originality or absurdity, from beauty or deformity. The plea of humanity is lost by going through the process of law. The firm and manly tone of principle is exchanged for the wavering and pitiful cant of policy. The living bursts of passion are reduced to a defunct commonplace, and all true imagination is buried under the dust and rubbish of learned models and imposing authorities. If the one is a bodiless phantom, the other is a lifeless skeleton. If the one in its feverish and hectic extravagance resembles a sick man's dream, the other is akin to the sleep of death, cold, stiff, unfeeling, monumental. Upon the whole, we despair less of the first than of the last, for the principle of life and motion is, after all, the primary condition of all genius. The luxuriant wildness of the one may be disciplined, and its excesses sobered down into reason, but the dry and rigid formality of the other can never burst the shell or husk of oratory. It is true that the one is disfigured by the puerilities and affectation of a Phillips, but then it is redeemed by the manly sense and fervor of a Plunkett, and the impassioned appeals and flashes of wit of a Curran, and by the golden tide of wisdom, eloquence, and fancy that flowed from the lips of a Burke. In the other, we do not sink so low in the negative series, but we get no higher in the ascending scale than a Mackintosh or a Brougham. Footnote: It may be suggested that the late Lord Erskine enjoyed a higher reputation as an orator than either of these, but he owed it to a dashing and graceful manner, to presence of mind, and to great animation in delivering his sentiments. Stripped of these outward and personal advantages, the matter of his speeches, like that of his writings, is nothing, or perfectly inert and dead. Mr. Brougham is from the north of England, but he was educated in Edinburgh and represents that school of politics and political economy in the House. He differs from Sir James Mackintosh in this, that he deals less in abstract principles and more in individual details. He makes less use of general topics and more of immediate facts. Sir James is better acquainted with the balance of an argument in old authors. Mr. Brougham with the balance of power in Europe. If the first is better versed in the progress of history, no man excels the last in a knowledge of the course of exchange. He is apprised of the exact state of our exports and imports, and scarce a ship clears out its cargo at Liverpool or Hull, but he has notice of the bill of lading. Our colonial policy, prison discipline, the state of the hulks, agricultural distress, commerce and manufactures, the bullion question, the Catholic question, the Bourbons or the Inquisition, domestic treason, foreign levy, nothing can come amiss to him. He is at home in the crooked mazes of rotten boroughs, is not baffled by Scotch law, and can follow the meaning of one of Mr. Canning's speeches. With so many resources, with such variety and solidity of information, Mr. Brougham is rather a powerful and alarming than an effectual debater. In so many details, which he himself goes through with unwearied and unshrinking resolution, the spirit of the question is lost to others who have not the same voluntary power of attention or the same interest in hearing that he has in speaking. The original impulse that urged him forward is forgotten in so wide a field, in so interminable a career. If he can, others cannot carry all he knows in their heads at the same time. A rope of circumstantial evidence does not hold well together, nor drag the unwilling mind along with it. The willing mind hurries on before it and grows impatient and absent. He moves in an unmanageable procession of facts and proofs instead of coming to the point at once, and his premise, so anxious is he to proceed on sure and ample grounds, overlay and block up his conclusions, so that you cannot arrive at it or nod till the first fury and shock of the onset is over. The ball, from the too great width of the caliber from which it is sent, and from striking against such a number of hard, projecting points, is almost spent before it reaches its destination. He keeps a ledger or a debtor and creditor account between the government and the country, posts so many actual crime, corruption, and injustice against so much contingent advantage or sluggish prejudice, and at the bottom of the page brings in the balance of indignation and contempt where it is due. But people are not to be calculated into contempt or indignation on abstract grounds, for however they may submit to this process where their own interests are concerned, in what regards the public good we believe they must see and feel instinctively, or not at all. There is, it is to be lamented, a good deal of froth as well as strength in the popular spirit, which will not admit of being decanted or served out in formal driblets, nor will spleen, the soul of opposition, bear to be corked up in square patent bottles and kept for future use. In a word, Mr. Brougham's is ticketed and labeled eloquence, registered and innumerous like the successive parts of a Scotch encyclopedia. It is clever, knowing, imposing, masterly, an extraordinary display of clearness of head, of quickness and energy of thought, of application and industry. But it is not the eloquence of the imagination or the heart, and will never save a nation or an individual from perdition. Mr. Brougham has one considerable advantage in debate. He is overcome by no false modesty, no deference to others, but then, by a natural consequence or parity of reasoning, he has little sympathy with other people, and is liable to be mistaken in the effect his arguments will have upon them. He relies too much, among other things, on the patience of his hearers, and on his ability to turn everything to his advantage. He accordingly goes to the full length of his tether, in vulgar phrase, and often overshoots the mark. C'est dommage, he has no reserve of discretion, no retentiveness of mind, or check upon himself. He needs, with so much wit, as much again to govern it. He cannot keep a good thing or a shrewd piece of information in his possession, though the letting it out should mar a cause. It is not that he thinks too much of himself, too little of his cause, but he is absorbed in the pursuit of truth as an abstract inquiry. He is led away by the headstrong and overmastering activities of his own mind. He is borne along, almost involuntarily and not impossibly, against his better judgment, by the throng and restlessness of his ideas as by a crowd of people in motion. His perceptions are literal, tenacious, epileptic, his understanding voracious of facts and equally communicative of them, and he proceeds to pour out all as plain as downright Shippen or as old Montaigne, without either the virulence of the one or the bonhomme of the other. The repeated, smart, unforeseen discharges of the truth jar those that are next to him. He does not dislike this state of irritation and collision, indulges his curiosity or his triumph, till by calling for more facts or hazarding some extreme inference, he urges a question to the verge of a precipice. His adversaries urge it over, and he himself shrinks back from the consequence, scared at the sound himself has made. Mr. Brougham has great fearlessness, but not equal firmness, and after going too far on the forlorn hope, turns short round without due warning to others or respect for himself. He is adventurous, but easily panic-struck, and sacrifices the vanity of self-opinion to the necessity of self-preservation. He is too improvident for a leader, too petulant for a partisan, and does not sufficiently consult those with whom he is supposed to act in concert. He sometimes leaves them in the lurch, and is sometimes left in the lurch by them. He wants the principle of cooperation. He frequently, in a fit of thoughtless levity, gives an unexpected turn to the political machine, which alarms older and more experienced heads. If he was not himself the first to get out of harm's way and escape from the danger, it would be well. We hold, indeed, as a general rule, that no man born or bred in Scotland can be a great orator unless he is a mere quack, or a great statesman unless he turns plain knave. The national gravity is against the first, the national caution is against the last. To a Scotsman, if a thing is, it is. There is an end of the question with his opinion about it. He is positive and abrupt, and is not in the habit of conciliating the feelings or soothing the follies of others. His only way, therefore, to produce a popular effect is to sail with the stream of prejudice, and to vent common dogmas, the total grist, unsifted husks and all, from some evangelical pulpit. This may answer, and it has answered. On the other hand, if a Scotsman born or bred comes to think at all of the feelings of others, it is not as they regard them, but as their opinions reacts on his own interest and safety. He is therefore either pragmatical and offensive, or if he tries to please, he becomes cowardly and fawning. His public spirit wants pliancy. His selfish compliances go all lengths. He is as impracticable as a popular partisan as he is mischievous as a tool of government. We do not wish to press this argument farther, and must leave it involved in some degree of obscurity, rather than bring the armed intellect of a whole nation on our heads. Mr. Brougham speaks in a loud and unmitigated tone of voice, sometimes almost approaching to a scream. He is fluent, rapid, vehement, full of his subject, with evidently a great deal to say, and very regardless of the manner of saying it. As a lawyer, he has not hitherto been remarkably successful. He is not profound in cases and reports, nor does he take much interest in the peculiar features of a particular cause, or show much adroitness in the management of it. He carries too much weight of metal for ordinary and petty occasions. He must have a pretty large question to discuss, and must make thorough-stitch work of it. He, however, had an encounter with Mr. Phillips the other day, and shook all his tender blossoms, so that they fell to the ground and withered in an hour, but they soon bloomed again. Mr. Brougham writes almost, if not quite, as well as he speaks. In the midst of an election contest, he comes out to address the populace, and goes back to his study to finish an article for the Edinburgh Review. Sometimes, indeed, wedging 3 or 4 articles, in the shape of refacimentos of his own pamphlets or speeches in Parliament, into a single number. Such, indeed, is the activity of his mind, that it appears to require neither repose nor any other stimulus than a delight in its own exercise. He can turn his hand to anything, but he cannot be idle. There are few intellectual accomplishments which he does not possess, and possess in a very high degree. He speaks French, and we believe several other modern languages, fluently, is a capital mathematician, and obtained an introduction to the celebrated Carnot in this latter character, when the conversation turned on squaring the circle, and not on the propriety of confining France within the natural boundaries of the Rhine. Mr. Brougham is, in fact, a striking instance of the versatility and strength of the human mind, and also, in one sense, of the length of human life, if we make a good use of our time. There is room enough to crowd almost every art and science into it. If we pass no day without a line, visit no place without the company of a book, we may, with ease, fill libraries, or empty them of their contents. Those who complain of the shortness of life, let it slide by them without wishing to seize and make the most of its golden minutes. The more we do, the more we can do. The more busy we are, the more leisure we have. If any one possesses any advantage in a considerable degree, he may make himself master of nearly as many more as he pleases by employing his spare time in cultivating the waste faculties of his mind. While one person is determining on the choice of a profession or study, another shall have made a fortune or gained a merited reputation. While one person is dreaming over the meaning of a word, another will have learnt several languages. It is not incapacity, but indolence, indecision, want of imagination, and a proneness to a sort of mental tautology, to repeat the same images and tread the same circle that leave us so poor, so dull, and inert as we are, so naked of acquirement, so barren of resources. While we are walking backward and forward between Charing Cross and Temple Bar, and sitting in the same coffee-house every day, we might make the grand tour of Europe and visit the Vatican and the Louvre. Mr. Brougham, among other means of strengthening and enlarging his views, has visited, we believe, most of the courts and turned his attention to most of the constitutions of the continent. He is no doubt a very accomplished, active-minded, and admirable person. Sir Francis Burdett, in many respects, affords a contrast to the foregoing character. He is a plain, unaffected, unsophisticated English gentleman. He is a person of great reading, too, and considerable information, but he makes very little display of these, unless it be to quote Shakespeare, which he does often with extreme aptness and felicity. Sir Francis is one of the most pleasing speakers in the House, and is a prodigious favorite of the English people. So he ought to be, for he is one of the few remaining examples of the Old English understanding and Old English character. All that he pretends to is common sense and common honesty, and a greater compliment cannot be paid to these than the attention with which he is listened to in the House of Commons. We cannot conceive a higher proof of courage than the saying things which he has been known to say there, and which seen him blush and appear ashamed of the truths he has been obliged to utter like a bashful novice. He could not have uttered what he often did there, if besides his general respectability he had not been a very honest, a very good-tempered, and a very good-looking man. But there was evidently no wish to shine, nor any desire to offend. It was painful to him to hurt the feelings of those who heard him, but it was a higher duty in him not to suppress his sincere and earnest convictions. It is wonderful how much virtue and plain dealing a man may be guilty of with impunity, if he has no vanity or ill nature or duplicity to provoke the contempt or resentment of others, and to make them impatient of the superiority he sets up over them. We do not recollect that Sir Francis ever endeavored to atone for any occasional indiscretions or intemperance by giving the Duke of York credit for the Battle of Waterloo, or congratulating ministers on the confinement of Bonaparte at St. Helena. There is no honest cause which he dares not avow, no oppressed individual that he is not forward to succor. He has the firmness of manhood with the unimpaired enthusiasm of youthful feeling about him. His principles are mellowed and improved without having become less sound with time, for at one period he sometimes appeared to come charged to the House with the petulance and caustic sententiousness he had imbibed at Wimbledon Common. He is never violent or in extremes, except when the people or the Parliament happen to be out of their senses. and then he seems to regret the necessity of plainly telling them he thinks so, instead of pummeling himself upon it or exulting over impending calamities. There is only one error he seems to labor under, which we believe he also borrowed from Mr. Horne Tooke or Major Cartwright, the wanting to go back to the early times of our Constitution and history in search of the principles of law and liberty. He might well hunt half a day for a forgotten dream. Liberty, in our opinion, is but a modern invention, the growth of books and printing, and whether new or old is not the less desirable. A man may be a patriot without being an antiquary. This is the only point on which Sir Francis is at all inclined to a tincture of pedantry. In general, his love of liberty is pure, as it is warm and steady. His humanity is unconstrained and free. His heart does not ask leave of his head to feel, nor does prudence always keep a guard upon his tongue or his pen. No man writes a better letter to his constituents than the member for Westminster, and his compositions of that kind ought to be good, for they have occasionally cost him dear. He is the idol of the people of Westminster. Few persons have a greater number of friends and well-wishers, and he has still greater reason to be proud of his enemies, for his integrity and independence have made them so. Sir Francis Burdett has often been left in a minority in the House of Commons with only one or two at his side. We suspect, unfortunately for his country, that history will be found to enter its protest on the same side of the question. Footnote: Mr. Brougham is not a Scotchman literally, but by adoption. End of chapter 14. The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits by William Hazlitt.
Chapter 15 of The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits by William Hazlitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jesse Zuba. Chapter 15. John Scott, 1st Earl of Eldon, and William Wilberforce. Lord Eldon and Mr. Wilberforce. Lord Eldon is an exceedingly good-natured man, but this does not prevent him, like other good-natured people, from consulting his own ease or interest. The character of good nature, as it is called, has been a good deal mistaken, and the present Chancellor is not a bad illustration of the grounds of the prevailing error. When we happen to see an individual whose countenance is all tranquillity and smiles, who is full of good humor and pleasantry, whose manners are gentle and conciliating, who is uniformly temperate in his expressions, and punctual and just in his everyday dealings, we are apt to conclude from so fair an outside that all is conscience and tender heart within also, and that such a one would not hurt a fly, and neither would he without a motive. But mere good nature, or what passes in the world for such, is often no better than indolent selfishness. A person distinguished and praised for this quality will not needlessly offend others, because they may retaliate, and besides, it ruffles his own temper. He likes to enjoy a perfect calm, and to live in an interchange of kind offices. He suffers few things to irritate or annoy him. He has a fine oiliness in his disposition, which smooths the waves of passion as they rise. He does not enter into the quarrels or enmities of others, bears their calamities with patience. He listens to the din and clang of war, the earthquake, and the hurricane of the political and moral world with the temper and spirit of a philosopher. No act of injustice puts him beside himself. The follies and absurdities of mankind never give him a moment's uneasiness. He has none of the ordinary causes of fretfulness or chagrin that torment others from the undue interest they take in the conduct of their neighbors or in the public good. None of these idle or frivolous sources of discontent that make such havoc with the peace of human life ever discompose his features or alter the serenity of his pulse. If a nation is robbed of its rights, if wretches hang that ministers may dine, the laughing jest still collects in his eye. The cordial squeeze of the hand is still the same. But tread on the toe of one of these amiable and imperturbable mortals, or let a lump of soot fall down the chimney and spoil their dinners, and see how they will bear it. All their patience is confined to the accidents that befall others. All their good humor is to be resolved into giving themselves no concern about anything but their own ease and self-indulgence. their charity begins and ends at home. Their being free from the common infirmities of temper is owing to their indifference to the common feelings of humanity, and if you touch the sore place, they betray more resentment and break out, like spoiled children, into greater fractiousness than others, partly from a degree of selfishness, and partly because they are taken by surprise and mad to think they have not guarded every point against annoyance or attack by a habit of callous insensibility and pampered indolence. An instance of what we mean occurred but the other day. An allusion was made in the House of Commons to something in the proceedings in the Court of Chancery, and the Lord Chancellor comes to his place in the court with the statement in his hand, fire in his eyes, and a direct charge of falsehood in his mouth, without knowing anything certain of the matter, without making any inquiry into it, without using any precaution or putting the least restraint upon himself, and all on no better authority than a common newspaper report. The thing was, not that we are inputting any strong blame in this case, we merely bring it as an illustration. It touched himself, his office, the inviolability of his jurisdiction, the unexceptionableness of his proceedings, and the wet blanket of the Chancellor's temper instantly took fire like tinder. All the fine balancing was at an end. All the doubts, all the delicacy, all the candor, real or affected, all the chances that there might be a mistake in the report, all the decencies to be observed towards a member of the House, are overlooked by the blindness of passion, and the wary judge pounces upon the paragraph without mercy, without a moment's delay, or the smallest attention to forms. This was indeed serious business. There was to be no trifling here. Every instant was an age till the Chancellor had discharged his sense of indignation on the head of the indiscreet interloper on his authority. Had it been another person's case, another person's dignity that had been compromised, another person's conduct that had been called in question, who doubts but that the matter might have stood over till the next term, that the noble lord would have taken the newspaper home in his pocket, that he would have compared it carefully with other newspapers, that he would have written in the most mild and gentlemanly terms to the honorable member to inquire into the truth of the statement, that he would have watched a convenient opportunity good-humoredly to ask other honorable members what all this was about, that the greatest caution and fairness would have been observed, and that to this hour the lawyers' clerks and the junior counsel would have been in the greatest admiration of the Chancellor's nicety of discrimination and the utter inefficacy of the heats, importunities, haste, and passions of others to influence his judgment. This would have been true, yet his readiness to decide and to condemn where he himself is concerned shows that passion is not dead in him, nor subject to the control of reason, but that self-love is the mainspring that moves it, though on all beyond that limit he looks with the most perfect calmness and philosophic indifference. Resistless passion sways us to the mood of what it likes or loathes. All people are passionate in what concerns themselves, and in what they take an interest in. The range of this last is different in different persons, but the want of passion is but another name for the want of sympathy and imagination. The Lord Chancellor's impartiality and conscientious exactness is proverbial, and is, we believe, as inflexible as it is delicate in all cases that occur in the stated routine of legal practice. The impatience, the irritation, the hopes, the fears, the confident tone of the applicants move him not a jot from his intended course. He looks at their claims with the lackluster eye of professional indifference. Power and influence apart, his next strongest passion is to indulge in the exercise of professional learning and skill, to amuse himself with the dry details and intricate windings of the law of equity. He delights to balance a straw, to see a feather turn the scale or make it even again, and divides and subdivides a scruple to the smallest fraction. He unravels the web of argument and pieces it together again, folds it up and lays it aside, that he may examine it more at his leisure. He hugs indecision to his breast, and takes home a modest doubt or a nice point to solace himself with it in protracted, luxurious dalliance. Delay seems, in his mind, to be of the very essence of justice. He no more hurries through a question than if no one was waiting for the result, and he was merely a dilettante, fanciful judge, who played at my Lord Chancellor, and busied himself with quibbles and punctilios as an idle hobby and harmless illusion. The phlegm of the Chancellor's disposition gives one almost a surfeit of impartiality and candor. We are sick of the eternal poise of childish dilatoriness, and would wish law and justice to be decided at once by a cast of the dice, as they were in Rabelais, rather than be kept in frivolous and tormenting suspense. But there is a limit even to this extreme refinement and scrupulousness of the Chancellor. The understanding acts only in the absence of the passions. At the approach of the lodestone, the needle trembles and points to it. The air of a political question has a wonderful tendency to brace and quicken the learned lord's faculties. The breath of a court speedily oversets 1,000 objections and scatters the cobwebs of his brain. The secret wish of power is a thumping make-weight, where all is so nicely balanced beforehand. In the case of a celebrated beauty and heiress, and the brother of a noble lord, the Chancellor hesitated long, and went through the forms as usual. But who ever doubted where all this indecision would end? No man in his senses, for a single instant. We shall not press this point, which is rather a ticklish one. Some persons thought that from entertaining a fellow feeling on the subject, the Chancellor would have been ready to favor the Poet Laureate's application to the Court of Chancery for an injunction against Wat Tyler. His lordship's sentiments on such points are not so variable. He has too much at stake. He recollected the year 1794, though Mr. Southey had forgotten it. The personal always prevails over the intellectual, where the latter is not backed by strong feeling and principle. Where remote and speculative objects do not excite a predominant interest and passion, gross and immediate ones are sure to carry the day, even in ingenuous and well-disposed minds. The will yields necessarily to some motive or other, and where the public good or distant consequences excite no sympathy in the breast, either from short-sightedness or an easiness of temperament that shrinks from any violent effort or painful emotion, self-interest, indolence, the opinion of others, a desire to please, the sense of personal obligation, come in and fill up the void of public spirit, patriotism, and humanity. The best men in the world, in their own natural dispositions or in private life, for this reason, often become the most dangerous public characters, from their pliancy to the unruly passions of others, and from their having no set-off in strong moral stamina to the temptations that are held out to them, if, as is frequently the case, they are men of versatile talent or patient industry. Lord Eldon has one of the best-natured faces in the world. It is pleasant to meet him in the street, plodding along with an umbrella under his arm, without one trace of pride, of spleen, or discontent in his whole demeanor, void of offense, with almost rustic simplicity and honesty of appearance, a man that makes friends at first sight, and could hardly make enemies if he would, and whose only fault is that he cannot say nay to power, or subject himself to an unkind word or look from a king or a minister. He is a thoroughbred Tory. Others boggle, or are at fault in their career, or give back at a pinch. They split into different factions, have various objects to distract them, their private friendships or antipathies stand in their way, but he has never flinched, never gone back, never missed his way. He is an out-and-outer in this respect. His allegiance has been without flaw, like one entire and perfect chrysolite. His implicit understanding is a kind of taffeta lining to the crown. His servility has assumed an air of the most determined independence, and he has read his history in a prince's eyes. There has been no stretch of power attempted in his time that he has not seconded, no existing abuse so odious or so absurd that he has not sanctioned it. He has gone the whole length of the most unpopular designs of ministers. When the heavy artillery of interest, power, and prejudice is brought into the field, the paper pellets of the brain go for nothing. His labyrinth of nice, ladylike doubts explodes like a mine of gunpowder. The Chancellor may weigh and palter. The courtier is decided, the politician is firm, and riveted to his place in the cabinet. On all the great questions that have divided party opinion or agitated the public mind, the Chancellor has been found uniformly and without a single exception on the side of prerogative and power, and against every proposal for the advancement of freedom. He was a strenuous supporter of the wars and coalitions against the principles of liberty abroad. He has been equally zealous in urging or defending every act and infringement of the Constitution, for abridging it at home. He at the same time opposes every amelioration of the penal laws on the alleged ground of his abhorrence of even the shadow of innovation. He has studiously set his face against Catholic emancipation. He labored hard in his vocation to prevent the abolition of the slave trade. He was Attorney General in the trials for high treason in 1794. and the other day in giving his opinion on the Queen's trial, shed tears and protested his innocence before God. This was natural and to be expected, but on all occasions he is to be found at his post, true to the call of prejudice, of power, to the will of others, and to his own interest. In the whole of his public career, and with all the goodness of his disposition, he has not shown so small a drop of pity as a wren's eye. He seems to be on his guard against everything liberal and humane as his weak side. Others relax in their obsequiousness, either from satiety or disgust, or a hankering after popularity, or a wish to be thought above narrow prejudices. The Chancellor alone is fixed and immovable. Is it want of understanding or of principle? No, it is want of imagination, a phlegmatic habit, an excess of false complacence and good nature. Common humanity and justice are little better than vague terms to him. He acts upon his immediate feelings and least irksome impulses. The king's hand is velvet to the touch. The woolsack is a seat of honor and profit. That is all he knows about the matter. As to abstract metaphysical calculations, the ox that stands staring at the corner of the street troubles his head as much about them as he does. Yet this last is a very good sort of animal, with no harm or malice in him, unless he is goaded on to mischief, and then it is necessary to keep out of his way or warn others against him. Mr. Wilberforce is a less perfect character in his way. He acts from mixed motives. He would willingly serve two masters, God and Mammon. He is a person of many excellent and admirable qualifications, but he has made a mistake in wishing to reconcile those that are incompatible. He has a most winning eloquence, specious, persuasive, familiar, silver-tongued, is amiable, charitable, conscientious, pious, loyal, humane, tractable to power, accessible to popularity, honoring the king, and no less charmed with the homage of his fellow citizens. What lacks he, then? Nothing but an economy of good parts. By aiming at too much he has spoiled all, and neutralized what might have been an estimable character, distinguished by signal services to mankind. A man must take his choice not only between virtue and vice, but between different virtues. Otherwise he will not gain his own approbation or secure the respect of others. The graces and accomplishments of private life mar the man of business and the statesman. There is a severity, a sternness, a self-denial, and a painful sense of duty required in the one, which ill befits the softness and sweetness which should characterize the other. Loyalty, patriotism, friendship, humanity are all virtues, but may they not sometimes clash? By being unwilling to forego the praise due to any, we may forfeit the reputation of all, and instead of uniting the suffrages of the whole world in our favor, we may end in becoming a sort of byword for affectation, cant, hollow professions, trimming, fickleness, and effeminate imbecility. It is best to choose and act up to some one leading character, as it is best to have some settled profession or regular pursuit in life. We can readily believe that Mr. Wilberforce's first object and principle of action is to do what he thinks right. His next, and that we fear is of almost equal weight with the first, is to do what will be thought so by other people. He is always at a game of hawk and buzzard between these two. His conscience will not budge unless the world goes with it. He does not seem greatly to dread the denunciation in Scripture, but rather to court it. Woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you. We suspect he is not quite easy in his mind because West India planters and Guinea traders do not join in his praise. His ears are not strongly enough tuned to drink in the execrations of the spoiler and the oppressor as the sweetest music. It is not enough that one half of the human species, the images of God carved in ebony, as old Fuller calls them, shout his name as a champion and a savior through vast burning zones, and moisten their parched lips with the gush of gratitude for deliverance from chains. He must have a prime minister drink his health at a cabinet dinner for aiding to rivet on those of his country and of Europe. He goes hand in heart along with the government and all their notions of legitimacy and political aggrandizement, in the hope that they will leave him a sort of no-man's ground of humanity in the great desert, where his reputation for benevolence and public spirit may spring up and flourish till its head touches the clouds, and it stretches out its branches to the farthest part of the earth. He has no mercy on those who claim a property in Negro slaves as so much livestock on their estates. The country rings with the applause of his wit, his eloquence, and his indignant appeals to common sense and humanity on this subject. but not a word has he to say, not a whisper does he breathe against the claim set up by the despots of the earth over their continental subjects, but does everything in his power to confirm and sanction it. He must give no offense. Mr. Wilberforce's humanity will go all lengths that it can, with safety and discretion, but it is not to be supposed that it should lose him his seat for Yorkshire, the smile of majesty, or the countenance of the loyal and pious. He is anxious to do all the good he can without hurting himself or his fair fame. His conscience and his character compound matters very amicably. He rather patronizes honesty than is a martyr to it. His patriotism, his philanthropy are not so ill-bred as to quarrel with his loyalty or to banish him from the first circles. He preaches vital Christianity to untutored savages and tolerates its worst abuses in civilized states. He thus shows his respect for religion without offending the clergy or circumscribing the sphere of his usefulness. There is in all this an appearance of a good deal of cant and tricking. His patriotism may be accused of being servile, his humanity ostentatious, his loyalty conditional, his religion a mixture of fashion and fanaticism. Out upon such half-faced fellowship, Mr. Wilberforce has the pride of being familiar with the great, the vanity of being popular, the conceit of an approving conscience. He is coy in his approaches to power. His public spirit is, in a manner, under the rose. He thus reaps the credit of independence without the obloquy, and secures the advantages of servility without incurring any obligations. He has two strings to his bow. He by no means neglects his worldly interests, while he expects a bright reversion in the skies. Mr. Wilberforce is far from being a hypocrite, but he is, we think, as fine a specimen of moral equivocation as can well be conceived. A hypocrite is one who is the very reverse of, or who despises the character he pretends to be. Mr. Wilberforce would be all that he pretends to be, and he is it, in fact, as far as words, plausible theories, good inclinations, and easy services go, but not in heart and soul, or so as to give up the appearance of any one of his pretensions to preserve the reality of any other. He carefully chooses his ground to fight the battles of loyalty, religion, and humanity, and it is such as is always safe and advantageous to himself. This is perhaps hardly fair, and it is of dangerous or doubtful tendency. Lord Eldon, for instance, is known to be a thorough-paced ministerialist. His opinion is only that of his party. But Mr. Wilberforce is not a party man. He is the more looked up to on this account, but not with sufficient reason. By tampering with different temptations and personal projects, he has all the air of the most perfect independence, and gains a character for impartiality and candor, when he is only striking a balance in his mind between the éclat of differing from a minister on some vantage ground, and the risk or odium that may attend it. He carries all the weight of his artificial popularity over to the government on vital points and hard-run questions, while they, in return, lend him a little of the gilding of court favor to set off his disinterested philanthropy and tramontane enthusiasm. As a leader or a follower, he makes an odd jumble of interests. By virtue of religious sympathy, he has brought the saints over to the side of the abolition of Negro slavery. This his adversaries think hard, and stealing a march upon them. What have these saints to do with freedom or reform of any kind? Mr. Wilberforce's style of speaking is not quite parliamentary. It is halfway between that and evangelical. He is altogether a double entendre. The very tone of his voice is a double entendre. It winds and undulates and glides up and down on texts of Scripture and scraps from Paley, and trite sophistry, and pathetic appeals to his hearers in a faltering, improgressive, sidelong way, like those birds of weak wing that are borne from their straightforward course by every little breath that under heaven is blown. Something of this fluctuating, time-serving principle was visible even in the great question of the abolition of the slave trade. He was, at one time, half inclined to surrender it into Mr. Pitt's dilatory hands, and seemed to think the gloss of novelty was gone from it, and the gaudy coloring of popularity sunk into the sable ground from which it rose. It was, however, persisted in and carried to a triumphant conclusion. Mr. Wilberforce said too little on this occasion of one, compared with whom he was but the frontispiece to that great chapter in the history of the world, the mask, the varnishing, and painting, the man that effected it by Herculean labors of body, and equally gigantic labors of mind, was Clarkson, the true apostle of human redemption on that occasion, and who, it is remarkable, resembles in his person and lineaments more than one of the apostles in the cartoons of Raphael. He deserves to be added to the 12. After all, the best as well as most amusing comment on the character just described was that made by Sheridan, who, being picked up in no very creditable plight by the watch, and asked rather roughly who he was, made answer, "I am Mr. Wilberforce." The guardians of the night conducted him home with all the honors due to grace and nature. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits, by William Hazlitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rolv. Chapter 16, Robert Southey. Mr. Southey, as we formerly remember to have seen him, had a hectic flush upon his cheek, a roving fire in his eye, a falcon glance, a look at once aspiring and dejected. It was the look that had been impressed upon his face by the events that marked the outset of his life. It was the dawn of liberty that still tinged his cheek, a smile betwixt hope and sadness that still played upon his quivering lip. Mr. Southey's mind is essentially sanguine, even to overweeningness. It is prophetic of good. It cordially embraces it. It casts a longing, lingering look after it, even when it's gone forever. He cannot bear to give up the thought of happiness, his confidence in his fellow man, when all else despair. It is the very element where he must live, or have no life at all. While he supposed it possible that a better form of society could be introduced than any that had hitherto existed, while the light of the French Revolution beamed into his soul, and long after it was seen reflected on his brow, like the light of setting suns on the peak of some high mountain, or lonely range of clouds floating in pure ether, while he had this hope, this faith in man left, he cherished it with childlike simplicity. He clung to it with the fondness of a lover. He was an enthusiast, a fanatic, a leveler. He stuck at nothing that he thought would banish all pain and misery from the world. In his impatience of the smallest error or injustice, he would have sacrificed himself and the existing generation, a holocaust, to his devotion to the right cause. But when he once believed, after many staggering doubts and painful struggles, that this was no longer possible, when his chimeras and golden dreams of human perfectibility vanished from him, he turned suddenly round and maintained that whatever is right. Mr. Southey has not fortitude of mind, has not patience to think that evil is inseparable from the nature of things. His irritable sense rejects the alternative altogether, as a weak stomach rejects the food that is distasteful to it. He hopes on against hope. He believes in all unbelief. He must either repose on actual or imaginary good. He missed his way in Utopia. He has found it at Old Sarum. His generous ardor no cold medium knows. His eagerness admits of no doubt or delay. He is ever in extremes, and ever in the wrong. The reason is that not truth, but self-opinion, is the ruling principle of Mr. Southey's mind. The charm of novelty, the applause of the multitude, the sanction of power, the venerableness of antiquity, pique, resentment, the spirit of contradiction, have a good deal to do with his preferences. His inquiries are partial and hasty, his conclusion raw and unconcocted, and with a considerable infusion of whim and humour and a monkish spleen. His opinion are like certain wines, warm and generous when new, but they will not keep, and soon turn flat or sour, for want of a stronger spirit of the understanding to give a body to them. He wooed liberty as a youthful lover, but it was perhaps more as a mistress than a bride. And he has since wedded with an elderly and not very reputable lady called Legitimacy. A wilful man, according to the Scotch proverb, must have his way. If it were the cause to which he was sincerely attached, he would adhere to it through good report and evil report, but it is himself to whom he does homage, and would have others to do so, and he therefore changes sides rather than to submit to apparent defeat or temporary mortification. Abstract principle has no rule but the understood distinction between right and wrong. The indulgence of vanity, of caprice, or prejudice is regulated by the convenience or bias of the moment. The temperature of our politician's mind is poetical, not philosophical. He is more the creature of impulse than he is of reflection. He invents the unreal, he embellishes the false with the glosses of fancy, but pays little attention to the words of truth and soberness. His impressions are accidental, immediate, personal, instead of being permanent and universal. Of all mortals, he is surely the most impatient of contradiction, even when he has completely turned the tables on himself. Is not this very inconsistency the reason? Is he not tenacious of his opinions in proportion as they are brittle and hastily formed? Is he not jealous of the grounds of his belief because he fears they will not bear inspection, or is conscious he has shifted them? Does he not confine others to the strict line of orthodoxy because he has himself taken every liberty? Is he not afraid to look to the right or the left, lest he should see the ghosts of his former extravagances staring him in the face? Does he not refuse to tolerate the smallest shade of difference in others because he feels that he wants the utmost latitude of construction for differing so widely from himself? Is he not captious, dogmatical, petulant in delivering his sentiments according as he has been inconsistent, rash, and fanciful in adopting them? He maintains that there can be no possible ground for differing from him because he looks only at his own side of the question. He sets up his own favorite notions as the standard of reason and honesty because he has changed from one extreme to the other. He treats his opponents with contempt because he is afraid of meeting with disrespect. He says that a reformer is a worse character than a housebreaker in order to stifle the recollection that he himself once was one. We must say that we relish Mr. Southey more in the reformer than in his lately acquired, but by no means natural or becoming, character of poet laureate and courtier. He may rest assured that a garland of wild flowers suits him better than the laureate wreath, that his pastoral odes and popular inscriptions were far more adapted to his genius than his presentation poems. He is nothing akin to birthday suits and drawing-room fopperies. He is nothing if not fantastical. In his figure, in his movements, in his sentiments, he is sharp and angular, quaint and eccentric. Mr. Southey is not of the court, courtly. Everything of him and about him is from the people. He is not classical, he is not legitimate. He is not a man cast in the mold of other men's opinions. He is not shaped on any model. He bows to no authority. He yields only to his own wayward particularities. He is wild, irregular, singular, extreme. He is no formalist, not he. All is crude and chaotic, self-opinionated, vain. He wants proportion, keeping, system, standard rules. He is not teres et rotundus. Mr. Southey walks with his chin erect through the streets of London, and with an umbrella sticking out under his arm in the finest weather. He has not sacrificed to the graces, nor studied decorum. With him everything is projecting, starting from its place, an episode, a digression, a poetic license. He does not move in any given orbit, but, like a falling star, shoots from his sphere. He is pragmatical, restless, unfixed, full of experiments, beginning everything anew, wiser than his betters, judging for himself, dictating to others. He is decidedly revolutionary. He may have given up on the reform of the state, but, depend on it, he has some other hobby of some kind. Does he not dedicate to his present majesty that extraordinary poem on the death of his father, called The Vision of Judgment, a specimen of what might be done in English examiners? In a court poem all should be trite and on an approved model. He might as well have presented himself at the levee in a fancy or masquerade dress. Mr. Southey was not to try conclusions with majesty, still less on such an occasion. The extreme freedoms with departed greatness, the party petulance carried to the throne of grace, the unchecked indulgence of private humor, the assumption of infallibility, and even of the voice of heaven in this poem, are pointed instances of what we have said. They show the singular state of overexcitement of Mr. Southey's mind, and the force of old habits of independent and unbridled thinking, which cannot be kept down, even in addressing his sovereign. Look at Mr. Southey's larger poems, his Kehama, his Thalaba, his Madoc, his Roderick. Who will deny the spirit, the scope, the splendid imagery, the hurried and startling interest that pervades them? Who will say that they are not sustained on fictions wilder than his own Glendoveer, that they are not the daring creations of a mind curbed by no law, tamed by no fear, that they are not rather like the trances than the waking dreams of genius, that they are not the very paradoxes of poetry? All this is very well, very intelligible, and very harmless, if we regard the rank excrescencies of Mr. Southey's poetry, like the red and blue flowers in corn, as the unweeded growth of a luxuriant and wandering fancy, or if we allow the yeasty workings of an ardent spirit to ferment and boil over. The variety, the boldness, the lively stimulus given to the mind may then atone for the violation of rules and the offences to bedridden authority, but not if our poetic libertine sets up for a lawgiver and judge, or an apprehender of vagrants in the regions either of taste or of opinion. Our motley gentleman deserves the strait waistcoat, if he is setting others in the stocks of servility, or condemning them to the pillory for a new mode of rhyme or reason. Or, if a composer of sacred dramas or classic models, or a translator of an old Latin author that will hardly bear translation, or a vamper-up of vapid cantos and odes set to music, were to turn pander to prescription and palliator of every dull, incorrigible abuse, it would not be much to be wondered at or even regretted. But in Mr. Southey it was a lamentable falling off. It is, indeed, to be deplored. It is a stain on genius, a blow to humanity, that the author of Joan of Arc, that work in which the love of liberty is exhaled like the breath of spring, mild, bonny, heaven-born, that is full of tears and virgin sighs, and yearnings of affection after truth and good, gushing warm and crimsoned from the heart, should ever after turn to folly, or become the advocate of a rotten cause. After giving up his heart to that subject, he ought not, whatever others might do, ever to have set his foot within the threshold of a court. He might be sure that he would not gain forgiveness or favor by it, nor obtain a single cordial smile from greatness. All that Mr. Southey is, or that he does best, is independent, spontaneous, free as the vital air he draws. When he affects the courtier or the sophist, he is obliged to put a constraint on himself, to hold in his breath. He loses his genius, and offers a violence to his nature. His characteristic faults are the excess of a lively, unguarded temperament. Oh, let them not degenerate into cold-blooded, heartless vices. If we speak or have ever spoken of Mr. Southey with severity, it is with the malice of old friends, for we count ourselves among his sincerest and heartiest well-wishers. But while he himself is anomalous, incalculable, eccentric from youth to age, the Wat Tyler and the Vision of Judgment are the alpha and omega of his disjointed career, full of sallies of humor, of ebullitions of spleen, making jets d'eau, cascades, fountains, and waterworks of his idle opinions. He would shut up the wits of others in leaden cisterns, to stagnate and corrupt, or bury them underground, far from sun and summer gale. He would suppress the freedom of wit and humor, of which he has set the example, and claim a privilege for playing antics. He would introduce a uniformity of intellectual ways and measures, of irregular meters and settled opinions, and enforce it with a high hand. This has been judged hard by some, and has brought down a severity of recrimination, perhaps disproportioned to the injury done. Because he is virtuous, it has been asked, are there to be no more cakes and ale? Because he is loyal, are we to take all our notions from the Quarterly Review? Because he is orthodox, are we to do nothing but read the Book of the Church? We declare we think his former poetical skepticism was not only more amiable, but had more of the spirit of religion in it, implied a more heartfelt trust in nature and providence than his present bigotry. We are, at the same time, free to declare that we think his articles in the Quarterly Review, notwithstanding the virulence and talent they display, have a tendency to qualify its most pernicious effects. They have redeeming traits in them. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump, and the spirit of humanity, thanks to Mr. Southey, is not quite expelled from the Quarterly Review. At the corner of his pen there hangs a vaporous drop profound of independence and liberality, which falls upon its pages and oozes out through the pores of the public mind. There is a fortunate difference between writers whose hearts are naturally callous to truth, and whose understandings are hermetically sealed against all impressions but those of self-interest, and a man like Mr. Southey, once a philanthropist and always a philanthropist. No man can entirely balk his nature. It breaks out in spite of him. In all those questions where the spirit of contradiction does not interfere, on which he is not sore from old bruises, or sick from the extravagance of youthful intoxication, as from last night's debauch, our laureate is still bold, free, candid, open to conviction, a reformist without knowing it. He does not advocate the slave trade, nor does he arm Mr. Malthus's revolting ratios with his authority. He does not strain hard to deluge Ireland with blood. On such points where humanity has not become obnoxious, where liberty has not passed into a byword, Mr. Southey is still a liberal and humane. The elasticity of his spirit is unbroken. The bow recoils to its old position. He still stands convicted of his early passion for inquiry and improvement. He was not regularly articled as a government tool. Perhaps the most pleasing and striking of all Mr. Southey's poems are not his triumphant taunts hurled against oppression, are not his glowing effusions of liberty, but those in which, with a mild melancholy, he seems conscious of his own infirmities of temper, and to feel a wish to correct by thought and time the precocity and sharpness of his disposition. May the quaint but affecting inspiration expressed in one of these be fulfilled, that as he mellows into mature age, all such asperities may wear off, and he himself become like the high leaves upon a holly tree. Mr. Southey's prose style can scarcely be too much praised. It is plain, clear, pointed, familiar, perfectly modern in its texture, but with a grave and sparkling admixture of archaisms in its ornaments and occasional phraseology. He is the best and most natural prose writer of any poet of the day. We mean that he is far better than Lord Byron, Mr. Wordsworth, or Mr. Coleridge, for instance. The manner is perhaps superior to the matter, that is, in his essays and reviews. There is rather a want of originality, and even of impetus, but there is no want of playful or biting satire, of ingenuity, of casuistry, of learning and of information. He is full of wise sauce and modern, as well as ancient instances. Mr. Southey may not always convince his opponents, but he seldom fails to stagger, never to gall them. In a word, we may describe his style by saying that he is not the body or thickness of port wine, but is like the clear sherry with kernels of old authors thrown into it. He also excels as a historian and prose translator. His stories abound in information and exhibit proofs of the most indefatigable patience and industry. By no uncommon process of the mind, Mr. Southey seems willing to steady the extreme levity of his opinions and feelings by an appeal to facts. His translations of the Spanish and French romances are executed con amore, and with the literal fidelity and care of a mere linguist. That of the Cid, in particular, is a masterpiece. Not a word could be altered for the better in the old scriptural style which it adopts in conformity to the original. It is no less interesting in itself, or as a record of high and chivalrous feelings and manner, that it is worthy of perusal as a literary curiosity. Mr. Southey's conversation has little resemblance to a commonplace book, his habitual deportment to a piece of clockwork. He is not remarkable either as a reasoner or an observer, but he is quick, unaffected, replete with anecdote, various and retentive in his reading, and exceedingly happy to play upon words, as most scholars are who give their minds the sportive turn. We have chiefly seen Mr. Southey in company where few people appear to advantage, we mean in that of Mr. Coleridge. He has not certainly the same range of speculation, nor the same flow of sounding words, but he makes up by the details of knowledge and by scrupulous correctness of statement for what he wants in originality of thought or impetuous declamation. The tones of Mr. Coleridge's voice are eloquence, those of Mr. Southey are meagre, shrill, and dry. Mr. Coleridge's forte is conversation, and he is conscious of this. Mr. Southey evidently considers writing as his stronghold, and if gravelled in an argument, or at a loss for an explanation, refers to something he has written on the subject, or brings out his portfolio, doubled down in dog-ears, in confirmation of some fact. He is scholastic and professional in his ideas. He sets more value on what he writes than on what he says. He is perhaps prouder of his library than of his productions, themselves a library. He is more simple in his manners than his friend Mr. Coleridge, but at the same time less cordial or conciliating. He is less vain, or has less hope of pleasing, and therefore lays himself less out to please. There is an air of condescension in his civility. With a tall, loose figure, a piqued austerity of countenance, and no inclination to embonpoint, you would say he has something puritanical, something ascetic in his appearance. He answers to Mandeville's description of Addison, a parson in a tie-wig. He is not a boon companion, nor does he indulge in the pleasures of the table, nor in any other vice. Nor are we aware that Mr. Southey is chargeable with any human frailty but want of charity. Having fewer errors to plead guilty to, he is less lenient to those of others. He was born and aged too late. Had he lived a century or two ago, he would have been a happy as well as blameless character. But the distraction of the time has unsettled him, and the multiplicity of his pretensions have jostled with each other. No man in our day, at least no man of genius, has led so uniformly and entirely the life of a scholar from boyhood to the present hour, devoting himself to learning with the enthusiasm of an early love, with the severity and constancy of a religious vow, and well would it have been for him if he had confined himself to this, and not undertaken to pull down or patch up the state. However irregular in his opinions, Mr. Southey is constant, unremitting, mechanical in his studies, and the performance of his duties. There's nothing Pindaric or Shandian here. In all the relations and charities of private life, he is correct, exemplary, generous, just. He never heard a single impropriety laid to his charge, and if he has many enemies, few can boast more numerous or stauncher friends. The variety and piquancy of his writings form a striking contrast to the mode in which they are produced. He rises early, and writes or reads till breakfast time. He writes or reads after breakfast till dinner, after dinner till tea, from tea till bedtime, and follows so the ever-running year with profitable labour to his grave, on Derwent's banks, beneath the foot of Skiddaw. Study never serves him for business, exercise, recreation. He passes from verse to prose, from history to poetry, from reading to writing, by a stopwatch. He writes a fair hand without blots, sitting upright in his chair, leaves off when he comes to the bottom of the page, and changes the subject for another as opposite as the antipodes. His mind is, after all, rather the recipient and transmitter of knowledge than the originator of it. He has hardly grasp of thought enough to arrive at any great leading truth. His passions do not amount to more than irritability. With some gall in his pen and coldness in his manner, he has a great deal of kindness in his heart. Rash in his opinions, he is steady in his attachments, and is a man in many particulars admirable, in all respectable, his political inconsistency alone excepted. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits by William Hazlitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arden. Chapter 17. Mr. T. Moore, Mr. Leigh Hunt. Or winglet of the fairy hummingbird, like atoms of the rainbow fluttering round. Campbell. The lines placed at the head of the sketch from a contemporary writer appear to us very descriptive of Mr. Moore's poetry. His verse is like a shower of beauty, a dance of images, a stream of music, or like the spray of the waterfall, tinged by the morning beam with rosy light. The characteristic distinction of our author's style is this continuous and incessant flow of voluptuous thoughts and shining illusions. He ought to write with a crystal pen on silver paper. His subject is set off by a dazzling veil of poetic diction, like a wreath of flowers gemmed with numerous dewdrops, weep, tremble, and glitter in liquid softness and pearly light, while the song of birds ravishes the ear, and languid odors breathe around, and aurora opens heaven's smiling portals. Pears and nymphs peep through the golden glades, and an angel's wing glances over the glossy scene. No dainty flower or herb that grows on ground, no arboret but painted blossoms dressed, and smelling sweet but there it might be found, to bud out fair, and its sweet smells throw all around. No tree whose branches did not bravely spring, no branch whereon a fine bird did not sit, no bird but did her shrill notes sweetly sing, no song but did contain a lovely dit. Trees, branches, birds, and songs were framed fit, for to allure frail minds to careless ease. Mr. Campbell's imagination is fastidious and select, and hence, though we meet with more exquisite beauties in his writings, we meet with them more rarely. There is comparatively a dearth of ornament, but Mr. Moore's strictest economy is wasteful and superfluous excess. He is always liberal, and never at a loss, for sooner than not stimulate and delight the reader, he is willing to be tawdry, or superficial, or commonplace. His muse must be fine at any rate, though she should paint and wear cast-off decorations, rather than have any lack of excitement. He repeats himself, and Eden, and Iblis, and cherub smiles fill up the pauses of the sentiment with a sickly monotony. It has been too much our author's object to pander to the artificial taste of the age, and his productions, however brilliant and agreeable, are in consequence somewhat meretricious and effeminate. It was thought formerly enough to have an occasionally fine passage in the progress of a story or a poem, and an occasionally striking image or expression in a fine passage or description, but the style, it seems, was to be exploded as rude, gothic, meagre, and dry. Now all must be raised to the same tantalizing and preposterous level. There must be no pause, no interval, no repose, no gradation. Simplicity and truth yield up the palm to affectation and grimace. The craving of the public mind after novelty and effect is a false and uneasy appetite that must be pampered with fine words at every step. We must be tickled with sound, startled with shew, and relieved by the importunate, uninterrupted display of fancy and verbal tinsel as much as possible from the fatigue of thought or shock of feeling. A poem is to resemble an exhibition of fireworks, with a continual explosion of quaint figures and devices, flash after flash that surprise for the moment and leave no trace of light or warmth behind them. Our modern poetry in its retrograde progress comes at last to be constructed on the principles of the modern opera, where an attempt is made to gratify every sense at every instant, and where the understanding alone is insulted and the heart mocked. It is in this view only that we can discover that Mr. Moore's poetry is vitiated or immoral. It seduces the taste and enervates the imagination. It creates a false standard of reference, and inverts or decompounds the natural order of association, in which objects strike the thoughts and feelings. His is the poetry of the bath, of the toilette, of the saloon, of the fashionable world, not the poetry of nature, of the heart or of human life. He stunts and enfeebles equally the growth of the imagination and the affections, and not taking the seed of poetry and sowing it in the ground of truth, and letting it expand in the dew and rain and shoot up to heaven, and spread its sweet leaves to the air, or dedicate its beauty to the sun. Instead of which, he anticipates and defeats his own object by plucking flowers and blossoms from the stem and setting them in the ground of idleness and folly, or in the cap of his own vanity, where they soon wither and disappear, dying or ere they sicken. This is but a sort of child's play, a short-sighted ambition. In Milton we meet with many prosaic lines, either because the subject does not require raising, or because they are necessary to connect the story, or serve as a relief to other passages. There is not such a thing to be found in all Mr. Moore's writings. His volumes present us with a perpetual feast of nectared sweets, but we cannot add, where no crude surfeit reigns. He indeed cloys with sweetness, he obscures with splendor, he fatigues with gaiety. We are stifled on beds of roses, we literally lie on the rack of restless ecstasy. His flowery fancy looks so fair and smells so sweet that the sense aches at it. His verse droops and languishes under a load of beauty, like a bough laden with fruit. His gorgeous style is like another morn risen on mid-noon. There is no passage that is not made up of blushing lines, no line that is not enriched with a sparkling metaphor, no image that is left unadorned with a double epithet. All his verbs, nouns, adjectives are equally glossy, smooth, and beautiful. Every stanza is transparent with light, perfumed with odors, floating in liquid harmony, melting in luxurious, evanescent delights. His muse is never contented with an offering from one sense alone, but brings another rifled charm to match it, and revels in a fairy round of pleasure. The interest is not dramatic, but melodramatic. It is a mixture of painting, poetry, and music, of the natural and preternatural, of obvious sentiment and romantic costume. A rose is a ghoul, a nightingale a bulbul. We might fancy ourselves in an eastern harem, amidst ottomans, and auto of roses, and veils, and spangles, and marble pillars, and cool fountains, and Arab maids, and genii, and magicians, and peris, and cherubs, and what-not. Mr. Moore has a little mistaken the art of poetry for the cosmetic art. He does not compose a historic group or work out a single figure, but throws a variety of elementary sensations, of vivid impressions together and calls it a description. He makes out an inventory of beauty, the smile on the lips, the dimple on the cheeks, item, golden locks, item, a pair of blue wings, item, a silver sound, with breathing fragrance and radiant light, and thinks it a character or a story. He gets together a number of fine things and fine names, and thinks that flung on heaps they make up a fine poem. This dissipated, fulsome, painted patchwork style may succeed in the levity and languor of the boudoir, or might have been adapted to the pavilions of royalty, but it is not the style of Parnassus, nor a passport to immortality. It is not the taste of the ancients. 'Tis not classical lore, nor the fashion of Tibullus, or Theocritus, or Anacreon, or Virgil, or Ariosto, or Pope, or Byron, or any great writer among the living or the dead, but it is the style of our English Anacreon, and it is or was the fashion of the day. Let one example, and that an admired one, taken from Lalla Rookh, suffice to explain the mystery and to soften the harshness of the foregoing criticism. Now upon Syria's land of roses, softly the light of eve reposes, and like a glory the broad sun hangs over sainted Lebanon, whose head in wintry grandeur towers, and whitens with eternal sleet, while summer in a veil of flowers is sleeping rosy at his feet. To one who looks from upper air, are all the enchanted regions there, of which must have been the glow, the life that's sparkling from below. Fair gardens shining, streams or ranks of golden melons on their banks, more golden where the sunlight falls, gay lizards glittering on the walls of ruined shrines, busy and bright, as they were all alive with light. And yet more splendid, numerous flocks of pigeons settling on the rocks, with their rich restless wings that gleam variously in the crimson beam of the warm west, as if enlaced with brilliance from the miner made, of tearless rainbows such as span the unclouded skies that Paris stand, and then the mingling sounds that come of shepherds ancient reed with hum, of the wild bees of Palestine, banqueting through the flowery vales, and Jordan those sweet banks of thine, and woods so full of nightingales. The following lines are the very perfection of Della-Cruscan sentiment, and affected orientalism of style. The parent exclaims on finding that old talisman and hackneyed poetical machine, a penitent here. Joy, joy forever, my task is done, the gates are passed and heaven is won. Oh, am I not happy? I am, to thee, sweet Eden. How dark and sad are the diamond turrets of Shadukiam and the fragrant bars of Amberabad. There is in all this a play of fancy, a glitter of words, a shallowness of thought, and a want of truth and solidity that is wonderful, and that nothing but the heedless rapid glide of the verse could render tolerable. It seems that the poet, as well as the lover, may bestride the gossamer that wantons in the idle summer air, and yet not fall so light as vanity. Mr. Moore ought not to contend with serious difficulties, or with entire subjects. He can write verses, not a poem. There is no principle of massing or of continuity in his productions, neither height nor breadth nor depth of capacity. There is no truth of representation, no strong internal feeling, but a continual flutter and display of affected airs and graces, like a finished coquette, who hides the want of symmetry by extravagance of dress, and the want of passion by flippant forwardness and unmeaning sentimentality. All is flimsy, all is florid to excess. His imagination may dally with insect beauties, with Rosicrucian spells, may describe a butterfly's wing, a flower pot, a fan, but it should not attempt to span the great outlines of nature, or keep pace with the sounding march of events, or grapple with the strong fibers of the human heart. The great becomes turgid in his hands, the pathetic insipid. If Mr. Moore were to describe the heights of Chimborazo, instead of the loneliness, the vastness, and the shadowy might, he would only think of adorning it with roseate tints like a strawberry ice, and would transform a magician's fortress in the Himalaya, stripped of its mysterious gloom and frowning horrors, into a jeweller's toy, to be set upon a lady's toilette. In proof of this, see above the diamond turrets of Shadukiam, etc. A description of Mokanna in the fight, though it has spirit and grandeur of effect, has still a great alloy of the mock heroic in it. The root of blood and death, which is otherwise well marked, is infested with a swarm of firefly fancies. In vain Mokanna, midst the general flight, stands like the red moon in some stormy night, among the fugitive clouds that hurrying by leave only her unshaken in the sky. The simile is fine, and would have been perfect, but that the moon is not red, and that she seems to hurry by the clouds, not they by her. The description of the warrior's youthful adversary, whose coming seems a lighted glory such as breaks in dreams, is fantastic and enervated. I feel the battle has nothing to do with dreams, and again the two lines immediately after, and every sword, true as ore, billows dim, the needle tracks the lodestar following him, are a mere piece of enigmatical ingenuity and scientific miminy-piminy. We cannot accept the Irish melodies from the same censure. If these national airs do indeed express the soul of impassioned feeling in his countrymen, the case of Ireland is hopeless. If these prettinesses pass for patriotism, if a country can heave from its heart's core only these vapid, varnished sentiments, lip deep, and let its tears of blood evaporate in an empty conceit, let it be governed as it has been. There are here no tones to awaken liberty, to console humanity. Mr. Moore converts the wild harp of Erin into a musical snuff-box. Footnote A. Compare his songs with Burns's. We do accept from this censure the author's political squibs, and the two-penny post-bag. These are essences, are nests of spicery, bitter and sweet, honey and gall together. No one can so well describe the set speech of a dull formalist. Footnote B. There was a little man, and he had a little soul, and he said, "Little soul, let us try," etc. Parody on, there was a little man, and he had a little gun. One should think this exquisite ridicule of a pedantic effusion might have silenced forever the automaton that delivered it, but the official personage in question at the close of the session addressed an extra-official congratulation to the Prince Regent on a bill that had not passed, as if to repeat and insist upon our errors or to justify them. End footnote B. Or the flowing locks of a dowager, in the manner of Akerman's dresses for May. His light, agreeable, polished style pierces through the body of the court, hits off the faded graces of an Adonis of 50, weighs the vanity of fashion in tremulous scales, mimics the grimace of affectation and folly, chews up the littleness of the great, and spears a phalanx of statesmen with its glittering point as with a diamond brooch. In choosing songs the regent named, had I a heart for falsehood framed, while gentle Hertford begged and prayed, for young I am, and sore afraid. Nothing in Pope or Prior ever surpassed the delicate insinuation and adroit satire of these lines, and hundreds more of our author's composition. We wish he would not take pains to make us think of them with less pleasure than formerly. The Fudge family is in the same spirit, but with a little falling off. There is too great a mixture of undisguised Jacobinism and fashionable slang. the divine Fanny Bias, and the mountains à la Russe figure in somewhat quaintly with Bonaparte and the Bourbons. The poet also launches the lightning of political indignation, but it rather plays round and illumines his own pen than reaches the devoted heads at which it is aimed. Mr. Moore is in private life an amiable and estimable man. The embellished and voluptuous style of his poetry, his unpretending origin, and his mignon figure soon introduce him to the notice of the great, and his gaiety, his wit, his good humour, and many agreeable accomplishments fixed him there, the darling of his friends and the idol of fashion. If he is no longer familiar with royalty as with his garter, the fault is not his. His adherence to his principles caused the separation. His love of his country was the cloud that intercepted the sunshine of court favour. This is so far well. Mr. Moore vindicates his own dignity, but the sense of intrinsic worth, of widespread fame, and of the intimacy of the great makes him perhaps a little too fastidious and exigeant as to the pretensions of others. He has been so long accustomed to the society of Whig lords, and so enchanted by the smile of beauty and fashion, that he really fancies himself one of the set, to which he is admitted on sufferance, and tries very unnecessarily to keep others out of it. He talks familiarly of works that are or are not read in our circle, and seated smiling and at his ease in a coronet coach, enlivening the owner by his brisk sallies and Attic conceits, is shocked as he passes to see a peer of the realm shake hands with a poet. There is a little indulgence of spleen and envy, a little servility and pandering to aristocratic pride in this proceeding. Is Mr. Moore bound to advise a noble poet to get as fast as possible out of a certain publication, lest he should not be able to give an account at Holland or at Lansdowne House, or how his friend Lord B had associated himself with his friend L.H.? Is he afraid that the spirit of monarchy will eclipse the fables for the Holy Alliance in virulence and plain speaking? Or are the members of the Fudge family to secure a monopoly for the abuse of the Bourbons and the doctrine of divine right? Because he is genteel and sarcastic, may not others be paradoxical and argumentative? Or must no one bark at a minister or a general, unless they have been first dandled, like a little French pug dog, in the lap of a lady of quality? Does Mr. Moore insist on the double claim of birth and genius as a title to respectability in all advocates of the popular side, but himself? Or is he anxious to keep the pretensions of his patrician and plebeian friends quite separate, so as to be himself the only point of union, a sort of double meaning between the two? It is idle to think of setting bounds to the weakness and illusions of self-love as long as it is confined to a man's own breast, but it ought not to be made a plea for holding back the powerful hand that is stretched out to save another struggling with a tide of popular prejudice, who has suffered shipwreck of health, fame, and fortune in a common cause, and who has deserved the aid and the good wishes of all who are, on principle, embarked in the same cause by equal zeal and honesty, if not by equal talents to support and to adorn it. We shall conclude the present article with a short notice of an individual who, in the cast of his mind and in political principle, bears no very remote resemblance to the patriot and wit just spoken of, and on whose merits we should descant at greater length, but that personal intimacy might be supposed to render us partial. It is well when personal intimacy produces this effect, and when the light that dazzled us at a distance does not on a closer inspection turn out an opaque substance. This is a charge that none of his friends will bring against Mr. Leigh Hunt. He improves upon acquaintance. The author translates admirably into the man. Indeed, the very faults of his style are virtues in the individual. His natural gaiety and sprightliness of manner, his high animal spirits, and the vinous quality of his mind produce an immediate fascination and intoxication in those who come in contact with him, and carry off in society whatever in his writings may to some seem flat and impertinent. From great sanguineness of temper, from great quickness and unsuspecting simplicity, he runs on to the public as he does at his own fireside, and talks about himself, forgetting that he is not always among friends. His look, his tone are required to point many things that he says. His frank, cordial manner reconciles you instantly to a little overbearing, overweening self-complacency. To be admired, he needs but to be seen. But perhaps he ought to be seen to be fully appreciated. No one ever sought his society who did not come away with a more favorable opinion of him. No one was ever disappointed, except those who had entertained idle prejudices against him. He sometimes trifles with his readers, or tires of a subject, from not being urged on by the stimulus of immediate sympathy. But in conversation he is all life and animation, combining the vivacity of the schoolboy with the resources of the wit and the taste of the scholar. The personal character, the spontaneous impulses, do not appear to excuse the author, unless you are acquainted with his situation and habits. like some proud beauty who gives herself what we think strange airs and graces under a mask, but who is instantly forgiven when she shews her face. We have said that Lord Byron is a sublime coxcomb. Why should we not say that Mr. Hunt is a delightful one? There is certainly an exuberance of satisfaction in his manner, which is more than the strict logical premises warrant, and which dull and phlegmatic constitutions know nothing of, and cannot understand till they see it. He is the only poet or literary man we ever knew who puts us in mind of Sir John Suckling, or Killigrew, or Carew, or who united rare intellectual acquirements with outward grace and natural gentility. Mr. Hunt ought to have been a gentleman born, and to have patronized men of letters. He might then have played and sung and laughed and talked his life away, have written manly prose, elegant verse, and a story of Rimini would have been praised by Mr. Blackwood. As it is, there is no man now living who at the same time writes prose and verse so well, with the exception of Mr. Southey, an exception we fear that will be little palatable to either of these gentlemen. His prose writings, however, display more consistency of principle than the laureate's, his verses more taste. We will venture to oppose his third canto of the Story of Rimini for classic elegance and natural feeling to any equal number of lines from Mr. Southey's epics or from Mr. Moore's Lalla Rookh. In a more gay and conversational style of writing, we think his epistle to Lord Byron on his going abroad is a masterpiece, and The Feast of the Poets has run through several editions. A light, familiar grace and mild, unpretending pathos are the characteristics of his more sportive or serious writings, whether in poetry or prose. A smile plays around the features of the one, a tear is ready to start from the thoughtful gaze of the other. He perhaps takes too little pains, and indulges in too much wayward caprice in both. A wit and a poet, Mr. Hunt is also distinguished by fineness of tact and sterling sense. He has only been a visionary in humanity, the fool of virtue. What then is the drawback to so many shining qualities that has made them useless or even hurtful to their owner? His crime is to have been editor of the Examiner 10 years ago, when some allusion was made in it to the age of the present king, and that, though his majesty has grown older, our luckless politician is no wiser than he was then. End of chapter 17. Recording by Arden.
Chapter 18 of The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits by William Hazlitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Elia and Geoffrey Crayon. So Mr. Charles Lamb and Mr. Washington Irvine choose to designate themselves, and as their lucubrations under one or other of these noms de guerre have gained considerable notice from the public, we shall here attempt to discriminate their several styles and manner, and to point out the beauties and defects of each in treating of somewhat similar subject. Mr. Irvine is, we take it, the more popular writer of the two, or a more general favorite. Mr. Lamb has more devoted and perhaps more judicious partisans. Mr. Irvine is by birth an American, and has, as it were, skimmed the cream, and taken off patterns with great skill and cleverness from our best known and happiest writers, so that their thoughts, and almost to their reputation, are indirectly transferred to his page, and smile upon us from another hemisphere, like the pale reflex of Cynthia's brow. He succeeds to our admiration and our sympathy by a sort of prescriptive title and traditional privilege. Mr. Lamb, on the contrary, being native to the manor here, though he too has borrowed from previous sources, instead of availing himself of the most popular and admired, has groped out his way and made his most successful researches among the more obscure and intricate, though certainly not the least pithy or pleasant of our writers. Mr. Washington Irvine has culled and transplanted the flowers of modern literature for the amusement of the general reader. Mr. Lamb has raked among the dust and cobwebs of a more remote period, has exhibited specimens of curious relics, and pored over moth-eaten, decayed manuscripts for the benefit of the more inquisitive and discerning part of the public. Antiquity, after a time, has the grace of novelty, as old fashions revived or mistaken for new ones, and a certain quaintness and singularity of style is an agreeable relief to the smooth and insipid monotony of modern composition. Mr. Lamb has succeeded not by conforming to the spirit of the age, but in opposition to it. He does not march boldly along with the crowd, but steals off the pavement to pick his way in the contrary direction. He prefers byways to highways. When the full tide of human life pours along to some festive shew, to some pageant of a day, Elia would stand on one side to look over an old bookstall, or stroll down some deserted pathway in search of a pensive inscription over a tottering doorway, or some quaint device in architecture illustrative of embryo art and ancient manners. Mr. Lamb has the very soul of an antiquarian, as this implies a reflecting humanity. The film of the past hovers forever before him. He is shy, sensitive, the reverse of everything coarse, vulgar, obtrusive, and commonplace. He would fain shuffle off this mortal coil, and his spirit clothes itself in the garb of elder time, homelier but more durable. He is born along with no pompous paradoxes, shines in no glittering tinsel of a fashionable phraseology, is neither fop nor sophist. He has none of the turbulence or froth of newfangled opinions. His style runs pure and clear, though it may often take an underground course or be conveyed through old-fashioned conduit pipes. Mr. Lamb does not court popularity, nor strut in gaudy plumes, but shrinks from every kind of ostentatious and obvious pretensions into the retirement of his own mind. The self-applauding bird, the peacock see, mark what a sumptuous Pharisee is he. Meridian sunbeams tempt him to unfold his radiant glories, azures, green and gold. He treads as if some solemn music near, his measured step were governed by his ear, and seems to say, Ye meaner fowl, give place, I am all splendor, dignity, and grace. Not so the pheasant on his charms presumes, though he too has a glory in his plumes. He, Christian-like, retreats with modest mien to the close copse or far sequestered green, and shines without desiring to be seen. These lines well describe the modest and delicate beauties of Mr. Lamb's writings, contrasted with the lofty and vainglorious pretensions of some of his contemporaries. This gentleman is not one of those who pay all their homage to the prevailing idol. He thinks that new-born gods are made and molded of things past, nor does he give to dust that is a little gilt, more laud than gilt or bedusted. His convictions do not in broad rumor lie, nor are they set off to the world in the glistering foil of fashion, but live and breathe aloft in those pure eyes and perfect judgment of all-seeing time. Mr. Lamb rather affects and is tenacious of the obscure and remote, of that which rests on its own intrinsic and silent merit, which scorns all alliance or even the suspicion of owing anything to noisy clamor, to the glare of circumstances. There is a fine tone of chiaroscuro, a moral perspective in his writings. He delights to dwell on that which is fresh to the eye of memory. He yearns after and covets what soothes the frailty of human nature. That touches him most nearly which is withdrawn to a certain distance, which verges on the borders of oblivion, that piques and provokes his fancy most, which is hid from a superficial glance. That which, though gone by, is still remembered, is in his view more genuine, and has given more vital signs that it will live, than a thing of yesterday that may be forgotten tomorrow. Death has in this sense the spirit of life in it, and the shadowy has to our author something substantial in it. Ideas savor most of reality in his mind, or rather his imagination loiters on the edge of each, and a page of his writings recalls to our fancy the stranger on the grate, fluttering in its dusky tensity, with its idle superstition and hospitable welcome. Mr. Lamb has a distaste to new faces, to new books, to new buildings, to new customs. He is shy of all imposing appearances, of all assumptions of self-importance, of all adventitious ornaments, of all mechanical advantages, even to a nervous excess. It is not merely that he does not rely upon or ordinarily avail himself of them. He holds them in abhorrence. He utterly abjures and discards them, and places a great gulf between him and them. He disdains all the vulgar artifices of authorship, all the cant of criticism, and helps to no notoriety. He has no grand swelling theories to attract the visionary and the enthusiast, no passing topics to allure the thoughtless and the vain. He evades the present, he mocks the future. His affections revert to and settle on the past. But then, even this must have something personal and local in it to interest him deeply and thoroughly. He pitches his tent in the suburbs of existing manners, brings down the account of character to the few straggling remains of the last generation, seldom ventures beyond the bills of mortality, and occupies that nice point between egotism and a disinterested humanity. No one makes the tour of our southern metropolis or describes the manners of the last age so well as Mr. Lamb, with so fine and yet so formal an air, with such vivid obscurity, with such arch piquancy, such picturesque quaintness, such smiling pathos. How admirably he has sketched the former inmates of the South Sea House. What fine fretwork he makes of their double and single entries. With what a firm yet subtle pencil he has embodied Mrs. Battle's opinions on whist. How notably he embalms a battered beau. How delightfully an amour that was cold 40 years ago revives in his pages. With what well-disguised humor he introduces us to his relations, and how freely he serves up his friends. Certainly, some of his portraits are fixtures and will do to hang up as lasting and lively emblems of human infirmity. Then there is no one who has so sure an ear for the chimes at midnight, not even excepting Mr. Justice Shallow, nor could Master Silence himself take his cheese and pippins with a more significant and satisfactory air. With what a gusto Mr. Lamb describes the inns and courts of law, the Temple and Gray's Inn, as if he had been a student there for at last 200 years, and had been as well acquainted with the person of Sir Francis Bacon as he is with his portrait or writings. It is hard to say whether St. John's Gate is connected with more intense and authentic associations in his mind as a part of old London Wall, or as the frontispiece, time out of mind, of the Gentleman's Magazine. He haunts Watling Street like a gentle spirit. The avenues to the playhouses are thick with panting recollections, and Christ's Hospital still breathes the balmy breath of infancy in his description of it. Whittington and his cat are a fine hallucination for Mr. Lamb's historic muse, and we believe he never heartily forgave a certain writer who took the subject of Guy Fawkes out of his hands. The streets of London are his fairyland, teeming with wonder, with life and interest to his retrospective glance, as it did to the eager eye of childhood. He has contrived to weave its tritest traditions into a bright and endless romance. Mr. Lamb's taste in books is also fine, and it is peculiar. It is not the worst for a little idiosyncrasy. He does not go deep into the Scots novels, but he is at home in Smollett and Fielding. He is little read in Junius or Gibbon, but no man can give a better account of Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, or Sir Thomas Browne's Urn Burial, or Fuller's Worthies, or John Bunyan's Holy War. No one is more unimpressible to a specious declamation. No one relishes a recondite beauty more. His admiration of Shakespeare and Milton does not make him despise Pope, and he can read Parnell with patience, and Gay with delight. His taste in French and German literature is somewhat defective, nor has he made much progress in the science of political economy or other abstruse studies. Though he has read vast folios of controversial divinity, merely for the sake of the intricacy of style, and to save himself the pain of thinking, Mr. Lamb is a good judge of prints and pictures. His admiration of Hogarth does credit to both, particularly when it is considered that Leonardo da Vinci is his next greatest favorite, and that his love of the actual does not proceed from a want of taste for the ideal. His worst fault is an over-eagerness of enthusiasm, which occasionally makes him take a surfeit of his highest favorites. Mr. Lamb excels in familiar conversation almost as much as in writing, when his modesty does not overpower his self-possession. He is as little of a proser as possible, but he blurts out the finest wit and sense in the world. He keeps a good deal in the background at first, till some excellent conceit pushes him forward, and then he abounds in whim and pleasantry. There is a primitive simplicity and self-denial about his manners, and a Quakerism in his personal appearance which is, however, relieved by a fine Titian head full of dumb eloquence. Mr. Lamb is a general favorite with those who know him. His character is equally singular and amiable. He is endeared to his friends not less by his foibles than his virtues. He ensures their esteem by the one, and does not wound their self-love by the other. He gains ground in the opinion of others by making no advances in his own. We easily admire genius where the diffidence of the possessor makes our acknowledgment of merit seem like a sort of patronage or act of condescension, as we willingly extend our good offices where they are not exacted as obligations or repaid with sullen indifference. The style of the Essays of Elia is liable to the charge of a certain mannerism. His sentences are cast in the mold of old authors, his expressions are borrowed from them, but his feelings and observations are genuine and original, taken from actual life or from his own breast, and he may be said, if anyone can, to have coined his heart for jests, and to have split his brain for fine distinctions. Mr. Lamb, from the peculiarity of his exterior and address as an author, would probably never have made his way by detached and independent efforts, but, fortunately for himself and others, he has taken advantage of the periodical press, where he has been stuck into notice, and the texture of his compositions is assuredly fine enough to bear the broadest glare of popularity that has hitherto shone upon them. Mr. Lamb's literary efforts have procured him civic honors, thing unheard of in our times, and he has been invited in his character of Elia to dine at a select party with the Lord Mayor. We should prefer this distinction to that of being poet laureate. We would recommend to Mr. Watheman's perusal, if Mr. Lamb has not anticipated us, the Rosamund Gray and the John Woodville of the same author, as an agreeable relief to the noise of a city feast and the heat of city elections. A friend, a short time ago, quoted some lines, footnote A, from the last mentioned of these works, which, meeting Mr. Godwin's eye, he was so struck with the beauty of the passage, and with the consciousness of having seen it before, that he was uneasy till he could recollect where, and after hunting in vain for it in Ben Jonson, Beaumont, and Fletcher, and other not unlikely places, sent to Mr. Lamb to know if he could help him to the author. Mr. Washington Irvine's acquaintance with English literature begins almost where Mr. Lamb's ends, with The Spectator, Tom Brown's works, and the wits of Queen Anne. He is not bottomed in our elder writers, nor do we think he has tasked his own faculties much, at least on English ground. Of the merit of his Knickerbocker and New York stories we cannot pretend to judge, but in his sketch-book and Bracebridge Hall he gives us very good American copies of our British essayists and novelists, which may be very well on the other side of the water, and as proofs of the capabilities of the national genius, but which might be dispensed with here, where we have to boast of the originals. Not only Mr. Irvine's language is with great taste and felicity modeled on that of Addison, Sterne, Goldsmith, or Mackenzie, but the thoughts and sentiments are taken at the rebound, and as they are brought forward at the present period, want both freshness and probability. Mr. Irvine's writings are literary anachronisms. He comes to England for the first time, and being on the spot, fancies himself in the midst of those characters and manners which he had read of in The Spectator and other approved authors, and which were the only idea he had hitherto formed of the parent country. Instead of looking round to see what we are, he sets to work to describe us as we were at second hand. He has Parson Adams or Sir Roger de Coverley in his mind's eye, and he makes a village curate or a country squire in Yorkshire or Hampshire sit to these admired models for their portraits in the beginning of the 19th century. Whatever the ingenious author has been most delighted with in the representation of books, he transfers to his portfolio, and swears that he has found it actually existing in the course of his observations and travels through Great Britain. Instead of tracing the changes that have taken place in society since Addison or Fielding wrote, he transcribes their account in a different handwriting, and thus keeps us stationary, at least in our most attractive and praiseworthy qualities of simplicity, honesty, hospitality, modesty, and good nature. This is a very flattering mode of turning fiction into history, or history to fiction, and we should scarcely know ourselves again in the softened and altered likeness, but that it bears the date of 1820, and issues from the press in Albemarle Street. This is one way of complimenting our national and Tory prejudices, and coupled with literal or exaggerated portraits of Yankee peculiarities, could hardly fail to please. The first essay in the sketchbook, that on national antipathies, is the best, but after that the sterling ore of wit or feeling is gradually spun thinner and thinner, till it fades to the shadow of a shade. Mr. Irvine is himself, we believe, a most agreeable and deserving man, and has been led into the natural and pardonable error we speak of by the tempting bait of European popularity, in which he thought there was no more likely method of succeeding than by imitating the style of our standard authors and giving us credits for the virtue of our forefathers. Footnote A. The description of sports in the forest. To see the sun, to bed and to arise, like some hot amorist with glowing eyes. End of section 18 by William Hazlitt.
Chapter 19 of The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits by William Hazlitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Garfield Dsouza. Chapter 19. James Sheridan Knowles. We should not feel that we had discharged obligations to truth or friendship if we were to let this volume go without introducing into it the name of the author of Virginius. This is the more proper, inasmuch as he is a character by himself, and the only poet now living that is a mere poet. If we were asked what sort of a man Mr. Knowles is, we could only say, he is the writer of Virginius. His most intimate friends see nothing in him by which they could trace the work to the author. The seeds of dramatic genius are contained and fostered in the warmth of the blood that flows in his veins. His heart dictates to his head. The most conscious, the most unpretending, the most artless of mortals, he instinctively obeys the impulses of natural feeling and produces a perfect work of art. He has hardly read a poem or a play or seen anything of the world, but he hears the anxious beatings of his own heart and makes others feel them by the force of sympathy. Ignorant alike of rules, regardless of models, he follows the steps of truth and simplicity, and strength, proportion, and delicacy are the infallible results. By thinking of nothing but his subject, he rivets the attention of the audience to it. All his dialogue tends to action, all his situations form classic groups. There is no doubt that Virginius is the best acting tragedy that has been produced on the modern stage. Mr. Knowles himself was a player at one time, and this circumstance has probably enabled him to judge of the picturesque and dramatic effect of his lines, as we think it might have assisted Shakespeare. There is no impertinent display, no flaunting poetry. The writer immediately conceives how a thought would tell if he had to speak it himself. Mr. Knowles is the first tragic writer of the age. In other respects, he is a common man, and divides his time and his affections between his plots and his fishing tackle, between the muses of spring and those mountain streams which sparkle like his own eye, that gush out like his own voice at the sight of an old friend. We have known him almost from a child, and we must say he appears to us the same boy poet that he ever was. He has been cradled in song and rocked in it as in a dream, forgetful of himself and of the world. End of chapter 19. End of The Spirit of the Age, or Contemporary Portraits by William Hazlitt.